It's outrageous. This community centre serves people who are in need, and this government wants to turn it into a debt collector. Shame.
The honourable member's time has expired. I have to report that the order of the day relating to the Prime Minister's motion of condolence in connection with the death of the Honourable Michael Eamon Bean has been debated in the Federation Chamber and is returned to the House. I present a certified copy of the motion. I understand it is the wish of the House to consider the matter immediately. The question is that the motion moved by the Honourable the Prime Minister be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On indulgence, today marks the 80th anniversary of the Manca Island massacre. Early today, I visited the Australian Service Nurses National Memorial and Anzac Parade. 80 years ago this week, the SS Vina Brook, a 1,670-tonne cargo vessel, fled Singapore a day before the city fell to the Japanese. The Vina Brook had 181 passengers, including 65 Australian nurses. Off Banker Island, in the Banker Strait, the Vina Brook was attacked by Japanese aircraft and was sunk. Over the course of the next 2 days, some 150 people eventually made it ashore to Raji Beach. They were sunburnt, they were dehydrated and they were exhausted. The survivors surrendered to the Japanese, expecting fair treatment, as they were mostly non-combatants. It was not to be. And on this day, 80 years ago, a terrible war crime took place. The men and women were separated. The men were shot and bayoneted. And the women, including 22 Australian nurses, were made to wade into the sea and then machine-gunned from behind. The sole survivor, Sister Vivian Bullwinkle, later said about the brave women who walked into that sea, they all knew what was going to happen to them, but no one panicked. They just marched ahead with their chins up. We now know of this atrocity because Sister Bullwinkle, though hit by a bullet, played dead and she survived. She hid along with another survivor, a wounded British soldier, Private Patrick Kingsley. After 12 days, Sister Bullwinkle and Private Kingsley surrendered again, choosing the risk of execution over the certainty of starvation. Private Kingsley died from his wounds shortly thereafter. Sister Bullwinkle became a prisoner of war for 3.5 years. And it was during this time that Sister Bullwinkle did something absolutely extraordinarily brave. She kept and hid the blood-stained uniform that had been pierced by a bullet. Had the uniform been found and its significance understood, certainly it would have meant death for her. The uniform she had worn on that day with its bullet hole now stays on display at the Australian War Memorial. It is a national treasure held in trust for all generations. Mr Speaker, it was that very piece of evidence that was presented to the War Crimes Tribunal. Mr Speaker, in the Hall of Memory at the Australian War Memorial there are 15 stained glass windows depicting Defence Force personnel. The window stands watch over the shrine of the tomb of the unknown soldier. One of those windows represents a nurse, and on it there is one word: devotion. And today, on this anniversary, we remember all who were killed, the service personnel, the civilians, and especially the nurses. We call to mind the thousands of Australian nurses who have served Australia in conflicts. We remember their devotion to their patients, to their country, and to their duty. And I have no doubt they're a great example of sacrifice and duty and service and love and care and compassion is exactly what has motivated the thousands upon thousands of nurses who have served the Australian community so faithfully and in such a dedicated way over the course of this pandemic. There could be no greater tribute to Sister Bullwinkle than the service that has been shown by our nurses over these past 2 years of the pandemic. But to all of those who were killed on that dreadful day, and all of those who have served, lest we forget.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. marched into the water at Benka to be machine-gunned in the back. There are many details in the Sydney Morning Herald's original report of the Benka massacre, but it is perhaps this line, unvarnished, unadorned, that jars the most. The brutal murder of 22 Australian nurses and a civilian woman on Radji Beach 80 years ago still shocks us. They were fleeing the fall of Singapore with British servicemen, only for their ship to be sunk by Japanese bombers. Washed up on the Indonesian island of Bangka, they were at the mercy of a ruthless enemy. Japanese soldiers took away the men and killed them. Then they murdered the women. Not troops who had taken up arms against them, but members of the most selfless, humane profession that we can imagine. As they waded into the surf and the fate that they knew awaited them, matron Irene Melville Drummond called out, "Cheer up, girls. I'm proud of you and love you all." Their courage is beyond imagining. They stood tall until the moment in which they fell, and yet one survived. Shot but alive, Vivian Bullwinkle played dead among those from whom life had just been so savagely torn. She eventually surrendered to a Japanese patrol because even after all that had happened, Ms. Bullwinkle knew that was her one chance of survival. She spent over 3 years in a prison camp, but survive she did. Vivian Bullwinkle then took the truth to the world. She took it to the families. She took it to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. As she explained, "I have tried so hard all this time to drive these scenes from my mind, and yet she was resolute. This story is one that must be told everywhere." She was the only one who could, even when it must have been just so difficult. When Holocaust survivor Primo Levi performed his final weighing up of the burden of the witness, he turned to the rhyme of the ancient mariner. "Since then, at an uncertain hour, that agony returns, until my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns." Historians would later say that Ms. Bullwinkle wasn't able to tell her full story, that the nurses were raped before they were killed, and that Ms. Bullwinkle was directed by the military to not reveal that detail in order to protect the families of those victims. But Vivian Bullwinkle kept bearing witness, and she kept honouring the profession that they had all served together. Indeed, as Vivian Statham, she became the matron of Melbourne's Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital and helped turn it into a teaching hospital. Today we think of those brave nurses working with this dreadful infectious disease that the world is dealing with at the moment, and their bravery on all of our behalf. Through her survival, so many more lives would be saved through her ongoing contribution as a nurse. Throughout it all, she made sure her friends who didn't come home would never be forgotten. A great Australian who we once again honour here today, lest we forget.
Questions without notice. Are there any questions?
To the Prime Minister. In Senate estimates today, the Minister for Aged Care Services said, and I quote, "I don't accept that deaths in the community or deaths in aged care is an indicator of his performance as a minister." 743 people have died of COVID in aged care this year alone. Does the Prime Minister agree with his minister that he is performing well?
Just before I do call the Prime Minister, did the Prime Minister need to make any statements in relation to ministers? No? Okay, thank you. The Prime Minister has a call.
In terms of... Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since the beginning of this year, as at the 15th of February, 711 people have died in residential aged care facilities. Deaths reported in residential aged care facilities in total to the 9th of February of this year is 5,728. Mr Speaker, every single life that has been lost to this virus, whether here or around the world, is a terrible tragedy for the families affected by those deaths. And that is one of the objectives that our government, working with other governments around the country, have worked tirelessly to seek to minimise through the course of this pandemic. And we will continue to do that, Mr Speaker. We will continue to do that. The work that we've done and the additional supports that we've put in place, which indeed have been supported by the Minister for Aged Care Services, led by the Minister for Aged Care, who is in this House, Mr Speaker, have been there to ensure that Australia, when compared with other countries around the world, have had one of the lowest rates of fatalities from COVID, including in residential aged care facilities. And so I say this, Mr Speaker, that while we mourn the loss of those who have passed away in aged care, who have had COVID when they've passed away, and as the Chief Medical Officer has been at pains to point out, passing away with COVID, Mr Speaker, is not the same of passing away because of COVID. Now, those opposite may interject on that, Mr Speaker, but that is the medical advice which has been provided by the Chief Medical Officer. But I would say this, Mr Speaker,
members on my
that
left,
for every life that has been lost, which we grieve, we give great thanks for the many thousands of lives, Mr Speaker, that have been saved by the actions of our aged care workers, our aged care providers, the actions of healthcare workers across the system, the nurses, the government officials, and indeed the policy leadership that has been provided by the government, Mr Speaker, including the Minister for Health and Aged Care and the Minister for Aged Care Services. So, Mr Speaker, if those opposite wish to use these issues for political exploitation, that is a matter for them. We will continue to get on with the job of saving as many lives as we have over the course of this pandemic.
The member for Fairfax has the call.
My question goes to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House why it is important not to appease or be intimidated from calling out those countries that seek to coerce and bully others? And how has the Morrison government led the way in not being intimidated by standing up to bullying and coercion, including in our region? And what has been the response to the government's approach?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and his concern on these matters. The Australian government remains deeply concerned about the ongoing threats of terrible violence against the people of Ukraine from Russia, Mr Speaker, a country that faces no threat from Ukraine whatsoever, but yet they face these terrible threats of intimidation and violence. Russia must unconditionally withdraw. There cannot be any dividend or concession provided in the name of appeasement to Russia, Mr Speaker. That is the view of my government. Cyber attacks have been reported to be undertaken on the Ukraine, on its government, on its defence forces and indeed its banks, and those reports run counter to the reports of suggestions of pullback which are unconvincing and unconfirmed. Mr Speaker, President Biden said this: "If Russia attacks Ukraine, it will be met with overwhelming international condemnation. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction." Well, Mr Speaker, there is one significant global power that pretends to international leadership that remains silent and even complicit when it comes to condemning the actions and threats of violence and intimidation of Russia, and that is the Chinese government, Mr Speaker, and that is deeply concerning to those who live here in the Indo-Pacific region. Mr Speaker, we have warned about these issues for some time, and as a government we have taken strong action to stand up to any coercion and any threats that have been levelled at Australia. And, Mr Speaker, we have been criticised for doing that as a government, including by those opposite. Mr Speaker, we have been further targeted as a country because of the strong stand that we have made. But, Mr Speaker, we have also earned the great respect of nations around the world, be those in Europe or the United States, Mr Speaker, who have seen what Australia has done, and they have been impressed, Mr Speaker, by our resolve and by our resistance. Mr Speaker, my government will never be the preferred partner of a foreign government, Mr Speaker, that has chosen to intimidate this country and has sought to threaten this country, Mr Speaker. They will not find a fellow traveller when it comes to threats and coercion against Australia in my government, Mr Speaker. I will never be their candidate.
When the member for McMahon is finished, I'll call the member for Hotham. The member for Hotham has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. 743 residents have died of COVID in aged care this year alone. Tens of thousands are not getting the care they need. This comes 2 years after the release of a Royal Commission report entitled simply Neglect. The aged care system is in crisis. Aren't all these things indicators that the Minister for Aged Care Services should be sacked today?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and to respectfully correct the member, this year, as the Prime Minister set out, sadly we've lost 711 residents in aged care in Australia, and as the Secretary of the Department has indicated in various discussions before the Senate, each life lost, no matter what the circumstances, anywhere in the country, is one which we grieve deeply, and we are aware that, of course, approximately 58% of those on the very latest data that we have were previously in palliative care, and so we feel for them and we thank the families and we thank all of those who've worked to protect them. In terms of Australia's actions, we are thankful for the work of our nurses and our carers that have helped deliver one of the lowest rates of loss of life in residential aged care in the world. And I think that that is a very important point. On the latest figures I have, Australia's...
Yes, the Minister for Health will resume his seat. The member for Hotham on the point of order.
Speaker, on relevance, the question was to the Prime Minister because it relates to the performance of his completely incompetent Minister for Aged Care, and the Minister answering the question cannot go to this point of who leads this sector for the country.
What's the point of order, I'm sorry?
The point of order is on relevance, Speaker. This is about the performance of the Minister and whether he should retain his job. That is not a question for the Minister for Aged Care and Health. It is a question for the Leader of this country, the Prime Minister.
No. All members in this House would know that the Prime Minister is able to direct a question to the appropriate minister. So, no. The Minister for Health has the call.
Perhaps the most germane of facts during the global pandemic is to understand what has happened in Australia compared with the rest of the world. In Ireland, the rate of loss In Ireland, the rate of loss of life is sadly 331% of that in Australia. In France, 543%. In Canada, 633%. In the USA, 668%. In Spain, 698%. In the UK, 879%. And in Belgium, 1,291%. All of these are fine countries. These are fine countries doing the finest work that they can, compassionately through their work to protect their citizens. They have been.
Member for Jaga.
They have faced a global pandemic, and each of those countries has saved lives. In Australia, more lives have been saved on that comparative basis than all of those which I set out. And we've done that through a series of actions. Firstly, beginning with the borders, the testing, the tracing, the distancing. But in addition to that, the specific measures within aged care. And these have been difficult measures. Indeed, we have a 99% vaccination rate amongst staff. Contrary to what has been put by some, we have a 92% vaccination rate amongst the residents and an 86.4% vaccination rate amongst eligible residents for boosters. In addition to that, what we've also put in place is this year alone, over 50 million units of PPE have been made available. The support for staff with the fourth of our retention bonuses, and in terms of residential aged care facilities and rapid antigen tests, 13.9 million tests have been provided directly, and over another 9 million tests have been provided through the pensioners' concessional scheme.
The
All of
minister's
these
time
have come
has
together.
expired. The member for Mallee has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is supporting Australian agriculture and future-proofing our agricultural supply chains? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any threats to these supply chains or any alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question and note how in the seat of Mallee, with legumes, with canola, with wheat, with so many citrus products, that she and the people of her area have done their part of not only feeding Australia but of assisting in the food task of the world. And a key component of that, Mr Speaker, of course, is urea, which is a vital fertiliser. Mr Speaker, 80% of the urea Australia uses comes from China. But this government has put $255 million on the table for the construction of a urea plant at Karratha. This will provide about 96% of Australia's urea needs. And this is an absolute statement of the preparedness of this side of the House to keep the sovereignty of our agricultural industry in place. Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Mallee also talks of alternate policies and threats. Now, of course, what we are seeing is the alternate government is a Green and Labor alliance, and they mock it. But actually, in this very city, we have a Green and Labor alliance. We have the fact that the Chief Minister Andrew Barr is in the Labor Party. Yet the Attorney-General, Shane Ratterbury, is in the Greens. We have Emma Davidson, the Assistant Minister, is in the Greens, but Tara Cheyne, the other Assistant Minister, is in the Labor Party. We have the Environment Minister, Rebecca Vassiotti, who's in the Greens, but the Transport Minister, Chris Steele, is in the Labor Party. So let's part company with this myth that there is not a Green and Labor alliance. We have Senator Katie Gallagher in the other place, who's never organised a business, but she has been the leader and organised a Green and Labor alliance. It is present not only in this city, is it present in this building, a Green and a Labor alliance. A galah.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition, the
have.
Deputy Prime Minister will just pause for one moment. The question goes to threats to supply chains. And it does talk about alternative policies, but I think the Deputy Prime Minister is straying somewhat, and I would ask him to return to the question.
Well, I thank you, Speaker, and I'd say why. Because the Greens believe in a moratorium in the production of gas. Now, you cannot produce urea with just nitrogen and water. You need gas, nitrogen and water to produce urea. And if you have a Green Labor Alliance, as exists in this very city, as existed in Tasmania, then you will have the inability for our nation to not only not feed the world, we won't be able to feed ourselves.
The member for... Just before I call the member for Gorton... The interjections are too high in the chamber, particularly from the member for Cooper. You look so innocent, but I'm sure it's coming from you. The member for Gorton has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. 9 days ago, the Prime Minister announced 1,700 defence personnel would be deployed into aged care homes. The Department of Health has admitted that of the 1,700 promised, only 106 personnel have been deployed. When the lives of aged care residents are at stake, why won't the Prime Minister do his job and deliver what he promised?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. At this point in time, as of today, there are 133 defence personnel who are...
I can't hear the Minister for Health.
133 defence personnel who have been deployed to assist in aged care. That includes 116 ADF personnel who are supporting the aged care sector and 17 ADF personnel who are deployed as ADF aged care support planning and coordination teams. Of those, 35 are currently providing clinical support, 7 in New South Wales, 10 in Victoria, 8 in South Australia, 10 in Queensland. 81 are currently providing general duty support. 17, as I mentioned, are providing coordination in the ACT. That means that at this stage there have been 25 aged care facilities that have been directly supported on the basis of the very terms which the Prime Minister set out, of those which were facing a significant, clear and present threat to the capacity to carry on operations. 19 are currently being staffed, with 6 of them having had their duties completed. Those include Greens Care Community in Murwillumbah, Ron Middleton VC Gardens, North Richmond, RSL Life Care Chura Beach, Dorothy Impey Home in Pascoe Vale, Anzac Lodge Private Nursing Home in Coburg, Coptic Hostel in Hallam, McGregor Gardens, Pakenham, Mercy Place Avenue, Shepparton, Mercy Place Shepparton, Bairnsdale Parklands Care in, Community in Bairnsdale, Embracia Moonee Valley in Avondale Heights, Churches of Christ Cardwell, The Good Shepherd in Townsville, Blue Care Alexandra Hill in Brisbane, Cabanata Aged Care in Rosewood, Tanunda Lutheran Home in Tanunda, Ridleyton Greek Home, Brompton, Ananda Aged Care, Happy Valley, South Australia, Juniper Signet Bentley in Bentley in Western Australia. In addition to that, what we see is that the ADF has played a significant role throughout the course of the pandemic. That role includes the work which was done in relation to previous outbreaks and support. We have, over the course of recent weeks, been able to support Victoria with ambulance drivers and support in terms of the transport of passengers. And in addition to that, they have been assisting with the dispatch of deliveries from the National Medical Stockpile. That National Medical Stockpile has seen supplies go to all aged care facilities in Australia to assist, whether it is with the rapid antigen test program. I mentioned before 13.9 million tests have been dispatched, whether it's in relation to the now over 50 million units of PPE, all up which have been provided. It is a well-known matter of fact and record that the government did also offer the Victorian government the use of ADF to assist with their hotel quarantine program. Unfortunately, that was not taken up.
The member for Melbourne has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. This week in estimates, government officials confirmed that projections for emissions from the enormous Beetaloo methane gas basin have increased by a whopping 5,000%, and this is before any of the gas is even burnt. Prime Minister, why are you continuing to push ahead with this giant climate bomb? If the 114 new coal and gas mines proposed by Liberal and Labor governments around the country go ahead, we will blow any chance of meeting even your weak climate targets. So will you back the Greens' call for a moratorium on new coal and gas mines?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The answer from my government, Mr Speaker, is no. The answer we would find out if there is a Labor government is we'll tell you later, Mr Speaker. We'll tell you later, after they've sat down with the Greens, Mr Speaker, and they would be seeking to negotiate the formation of a government in that Greens and Labor alliance, the Galah Party, Mr Speaker. The Greens
The Prime
and Labor
Minister
alliance.
will just return to the question, please.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'll ask the Minister for Resources to add further to my answer.
The Minister for Resources.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And to reiterate the Prime Minister's position, we are not closing coal, oil and gas projects in this country. We are not. In regards to the emissions piece that the member has raised, Mr Speaker, this is pretty straightforward. The Beetaloo Basin is not currently online. And for those who know anything about the resources sector, well, you all know that these projects and these basins deplete over time. That is why we must have a pipeline of projects in this country to make sure we can continue to supply gas, not only for our domestic consumption, but to meet our international contracts. And Mr Speaker, we only have to look at what happened in the recent pandemic. This country maintained its reputation as a reliable supplier. In fact, it exceeded all expectations. It exceeded all expectations by delivering on its contracts, meeting its commitments, providing resources and energy to its trading partners, which has kept the lights on, Mr Speaker, not just here, but right around the world, in South Korea, in Japan, in other countries where we have trade agreements and contracts which we have met. So, Mr Speaker, I say to those opposite, and I say to the member asking the question—
The Minister will resume his seat for one moment. The member for Melbourne on a point of order.
On relevance, more than halfway through the question was about climate, and I thought the government might at least like to mention climate change once.
The question specifically went to the Beetaloo Basin. So the Minister is addressing it, and the Minister is relevant. The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. We'll come to the question that the members put. We have reduced emissions by 20%. No one else has done that, not those opposite, no one before us. They are down by 20%. So I say to the member for Melbourne, we are taking a balanced position. We are delivering for our nation, not only in terms of the economy and jobs, but making sure we have a reliable and affordable supply of not only gas but electricity for this country. Mr Speaker, can you imagine where we would be if the member for Melbourne and the Greens teamed up with those opposite to implement that policy? $500 billion worth of investment will be lost. That is the cost, Mr Speaker. This is what's been put forward by the member for Melbourne and the Greens, a policy where they would not allow any future coal, oil or gas production, no new projects in this country, 80,000 jobs, $500 billion worth of investment would be lost, and it would be supported by those.
The Minister is entitled to compare and contrast, but there was no part of the question in relation to alternative approaches. So I'd ask the Minister to return to the question.
Of course, Mr Speaker. So back to the Beetaloo, Mr Speaker. What we know is that the Beetaloo Basin is one of the biggest gas developments in the world. It will drive billions of dollars of investment for the Northern Territory, thousands of jobs for Australians, and continue to deliver for our economy. And this is how we pay for roads and schools and hospitals.
The Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House why the Morrison government's proven record of keeping taxes low will always be a priority of the members of this side of the House, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Herbert for his question and acknowledge his distinguished service in uniform on behalf of our country, and also his support for lower taxes, which are being used by businesses in Townsville, fair dinkum builds, which has bought a couple of scissor lifts with the benefit of our immediate expensing provisions. Now, we on this side of the House have cut taxes for families. We on this side of the House have cut taxes for small business down to the lowest level in 50 years. And we've put in place record business investment incentives through our tax system. But we have been opposed every step of the way by a Greens-Labor coalition and by a Labor leader who has never delivered a budget, never held a Treasury portfolio and who thinks tabling his high school essay are good enough credentials to run a $2 trillion economy.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of
Try not to smile.
Members on my right. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The point of order is on relevance. The question that was asked of the Treasurer essentially went to the government's own tax record. He couldn't sustain an answer on that for more than 45 seconds, which in part is because it's the second highest taxing government in our country.
The Deputy Leader knows that there's no set time frame that a member or a minister needs to talk to in the 3 minutes. The Treasurer did refer to government tax policy and then was dealing with alternative approaches. The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. This Leader of the Opposition can't be trusted to implement our legislated tax cuts for families because he described them as tax cuts for the top end of town. This Leader of the Opposition can't be trusted to deliver lower taxes for the Australian people because he supported a carbon tax, a mining tax, a congestion tax, a retirees tax, a housing tax, higher taxes on super, higher taxes on income earners and a family business tax. And of course he has supported death duties, Mr Speaker, and an inheritance tax. But it's not just the Greens who are supporting his call for an inheritance tax, it's also his comrades in the union movement, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Because less than 6 months ago, the ACTU put out their tax plan. There it is, in all its glory, in page 2, calling for an inheritance tax, Mr Speaker. Now, why is this important? Why is this important? Because this Leader of the Opposition has said successful...
The Treasurer will resume. I hope this is a valid point of order. The Manager of Opposition Business on
There's a requirement that members be referred to by their title, and he's referring to someone who brought in death duties, and he should be referring to the member for Mackellar. He's the only person who's been arguing for it.
The Manager for Opposition Business will resume his seat. Once again, the level of interjections is far too high. I think the only people who can hear what's being said are those watching the television because they have a direct feed through the microphone. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, as we know, the Greens and the Labor Party have been in coalition in the past, and the Greens today are calling for an inheritance tax. But also the unions. The unions are calling for an inheritance tax. Why is this relevant? Because this Leader of the Opposition has said, and I quote, "Successful Labor governments collaborate with the unions," Mr Speaker. Now this is their tax policy. This is the ACTU's tax policies. So that's the troika the Australian people will get. If the Labor Party ever got their chance to sit on the Treasury benches, you get the Labor, the Greens and the ACTU in cahoots, Mr Speaker, promising higher taxes and death duties.
The member for Rankin has the call.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Yesterday, the Treasurer told the House that he was concerned that political donations weren't being disclosed. Can the Treasurer confirm his Kooyong 200 Club raised $1.1 million in donations last financial year but named no individual donors in its AEC return? Why didn't he refer to this failure to disclose in his answer yesterday?
Yeah. Order. Order. Member for McNamara. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, I see you've already gone to the relevant page, but it's clearly not within the Treasurer's responsibility. It's not a question that can be asked of him under the standing orders, and it should be ruled out of order.
The Manager of Opposition Business on the point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. To the point of order.
I'll just pause one moment.
Yeah, sure.
Two more days to go. But who's counting? The Manager of Opposition Business on the point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. It has long been the case that issues which are normally not allowed to be asked of ministers, the door is opened when they give answers on the same topic. It has frequently been the case where we've had ministers, for example, long precedents with the previous Speaker, where there's a normal prohibition on someone not being able to be asked about a previous portfolio. If they give a long answer when they're asked about a statement that they've issued, we've been allowed to continue to penetrate and ask questions about those answers. Had the Treasurer not given the answer he gave yesterday, I agree, this would be completely out of order. But yesterday, the Treasurer opened the door wide to the question of whether or not people are disclosing donations. He decided to lead with his chin, he's opened the door wide, and we are simply asking him about that answer yesterday.
Well, just with the Manager of Opposition Business, I'm happy to, if you'd like to take me to the relevant part of the practice that supports that proposition, happy to look at it. Do you want to take me to the relevant part of the practice?
Sorry,
yeah.
Do I have the call?
Sorry?
Do I have the call?
Yes.
Yes, sir. So you're saying unless I, out of a 700-page book, come right now with the correct page, you're going to overrule a precedent that we've been using in this House since Federation?
Well, let me just say on this that the Manager...
I'm happy to go and start finding the page, but really?
The Manager of Opposition Business is dangerously close to reflecting on the chair. You're asking me to rule on something.
Yeah, but you... Sorry, if I have the call?
You're asking me to rule on something.
Yes.
And I'm asking you what you're relying on.
Yeah, and if I have the call, I'll respond. I won't respond without the call.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I was saying I won't respond unless you give me the call.
Yeah, the Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Mr Speaker, when you were a private member in this place, you have sat in this chamber as this precedent has been used. You have sat here time after time when a member has been when a minister has been challenged, but in particular this has happened where they've held a previous portfolio. And in each of the questions...
Members on my right, I need to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
And in each of the questions that have been asked from the opposition, they have always had the same form of the first line, which is referring to the previous answers. If that line's not there, the ruling has always been the question is out of order. But if the question that follows does refer specifically to previous answers, it has been in order and it has been a practice that we've been following.
I'll allow the question, but I will have a closer look at it overnight. But I will allow the question. The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, we adhere to the relevant rules, but what my comments were yesterday was about the member for Warringah and the $100,000 donation from people linked to coal companies, Mr Speaker, and the absolute hypocrisy of the independents, Mr Speaker, because the reality is a vote for the independents is a vote for the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, and that is because the independents include former members of the Labor Party, including in my electorate of the seat of Kooyong. They claim to be a clean skin, but they're former members of the ALP. And when the independents come into this place, they vote for the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. So the fact of the matter is, a vote for the independents is a...
The Treasurer has concluded his answer. The Treasurer has concluded his answer. The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the Morrison government's tax cuts and tax incentives are generating jobs in my electorate of Robertson and around Australia? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question and acknowledge her strong support for small business in her electorate. Like for Emma with the Daily Dough Company, Emma, 18 years of age, lost her job during the middle of the pandemic, and she went on to start up a small business, a donut-making company that makes 2,000 donuts a day, Mr Speaker, now employs 40 people and has used our immediate expensing provisions to buy a van to expand its business, Mr Speaker. That is a wonderful story of resilience during this pandemic and small business having a go and getting a go, Mr Speaker. And our tax cuts have provided more money for people as a result of their hard-earned efforts. It's recognised their aspiration, it's rewarded their aspiration, it's supported small businesses, and of course it's backing them when they back themselves with these investment incentives. Now, that is our track record, cutting taxes. That is our policies, Mr Speaker. That is what we believe in. The same can't be said for those opposite, because this Leader of the Opposition, who's never delivered a budget, never held a Treasury portfolio, he has stood for higher taxes his whole career. He described our tax cuts for families as being for the top end of town. He stood by the member for McMahon when the member for McMahon told the Australian people, if you don't like our $387 billion of higher taxes, don't vote for us. And of course, this Leader of the Opposition supported a retirees tax, a housing tax, higher taxes on super, higher taxes on income earners and a family business tax. And now we know that he also has supported an inheritance tax. And he's been supported by the Greens, and he's been supported by the unions. But the Leader of the Opposition, in advocating for an inheritance tax, has even been supported by someone on his own side, Mr Speaker. A person that the Leader of the Opposition has described as a first-class economist. Who could that be who wrote a paper titled Bring Back the Inheritance Tax, Mr Speaker? Who could have that been on the other side who said, bring back the inheritance tax? Who was it, Mr Speaker? It was the comrade from Fenner, Mr Speaker. The comrade from Fenner, the original Bolshevik, Mr Speaker. The original Bolshevik, the comrade for Fenner, who, like the Leader of the Opposition, has advocated for higher taxes, who, like the Leader of the Opposition, has advocated for $387 billion of higher taxes on the Australian people. Only this side of the House will deliver lower taxes and more jobs.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask, does the Prime Minister have confidence in his Education Minister?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The matters relating to the Minister for Education I've been taking extremely seriously, and members will be aware of the independent process established with Vivienne Thom. Mr Speaker, the matter is in process and it is not concluded, and in fairness to all involved in this matter, it would not be appropriate to make further comment at this time.
The member for Moncrieff has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the minister update the House on steps the Morrison government is taking to safeguard Australia amid a deteriorating global security environment by working with strategic partners and allies? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question and acknowledge her own family's history and contribution to this country and to the security of this country, Mr Speaker. And the security of this country is more important than ever, given the dire situation as it unfolds in the Ukraine, as we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific, the build-up of missiles and nuclear weapons by the Chinese government. This is a very serious time, Mr Speaker, and we need to be in a position of strength as a country to work with our allies, to invest appropriately, to make sure that we can take the decisions that will allow us to keep our country safe not only today but into the decades ahead. Mr Speaker, this government announced the AUKUS agreement as a key part of the defence of our nation and a very important part of the deterrence of any aggressor who would seek to take action against Australia. Mr Speaker, the declaration is a clear one from our country, from the United Kingdom, from the United States, that we stand, that we stand as one against aggression and coercion. We don't believe that the alliance between China and Russia is in the world's best interests, and we will continue to take decisions and make investments, Mr Speaker, into our Australian Defence Force to keep us safe. Now, there are many people who opposed AUKUS, and I think it's important for people, and I'm asked about alternative approaches, to understand the difference between this side of the House that has built up the investment in defence after Labor cut it to the lowest level since 1938. And, Mr Speaker, we have invested in our relationship, so AUKUS is a result of that, Mr Speaker, designed specifically to keep our country safe. So if people are asking what would the other side of politics bring if they were elected at the next election, well, it's a fair question to ask, Mr Speaker. And if you want to know what an Albanese-backed government would do, Mr Speaker, after the next election, what would a Labor-Greens alliance do? It's an important question, Mr Speaker. It's an important question.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The point of order is on the basis of relevance. Obviously, the assertion that's just been made there is not true and can't be relevant. No, but the only relevant answer to this question has got to be the failure of this government on submarines.
The Minister for Defence is being relevant to the question. The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. So if you ask yourself, well, why in government last time did Labor rip money from the Australian Defence Force? Why did they take it away from our troops? Well, in part, Mr Speaker, it was because of the pressures that they put on themselves through the relationship with the Greens. And we know, Mr Speaker, at least the Greens are honest about taking money from defence before the election. The Labor Party always does it after the election. I want to tell you before the election that they're no different to the coalition, that they'll just power on and keep support going. They never do it when they're in government. And, Mr Speaker, we know that the Greens announced recently that in relation to AUKUS, and this is their policy, the Greens have today announced that in the balance of power after the next election, that is their coalition, they will push to boldly reform our Defence Force to ensure a peace-focused approach is prioritised, reduce spending to 1% and to break the AUKUS agreement.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Just before, Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table the article by the member for Wentworth, reach out to Russia to manage the rise of China. How's that working out? How's that working out?
Leave granted.
Leave's not granted.
Leave is not granted. The member for Moreton Just before the member for Moreton starts, the member for Moreton has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm the Minister for Education's name has been taken off his door? Did this happen before or after there was a discussion in Cabinet about him being sacked?
The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is responsible for the economic management of this country, responsible for national security, for guiding our country through a pandemic, for many things. But, Mr Speaker, he is not responsible, I'm sorry to inform the member, for sign writing or for placement of door names in this building. Now, that might come as a shock to this undergraduate member, Mr Speaker, who has not troubled the front bench ever. And, Mr Speaker, it cannot be in order, this question.
The Minister for Defence, the Leader of the House, to resume his seat. The question, I'm happy to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business if you want to be heard on it, but I'm going to rule that
as to whether he's
Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, there's only one minister whose name has been removed from their office door.
No,
if the Prime Minister wants to say in his answer...
The Manager of Opposition Business is not making a point of order. He is speaking to the point of order.
Yeah.
So the Manager of Opposition Business, I'm giving the Manager of Opposition Business an opportunity...
Yeah, to respond to what the Leader of the House said.
The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
So it is advice from the Prime Minister's office and from the Prime Minister that causes the parliament to put the names of ministers on doors. Now, if it's just a coincidence that of all the ministers, it just happens to be the Minister for Education who's been disappeared in this way, then that can be the answer.
I think I've heard the Manager for Opposition Business sufficiently. A valiant effort as it was. The question is out of order. It's not within the Prime Minister's purview, and I will give the call to the member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have an important question for the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is defending Australia's trade interests and the global rules-based trading system, and is the Minister aware of any alternative arrangements?
The Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Braddon for his question and his electorate exports out of Australia right around the world. He understands how important our trade policy is, and our trade policy has been proactive, it's been principled and it's been patient. And it's those 3 Ps that we've adopted because they're an important way for us to conduct our trade policy. 9 FTAs concluded since we came to government. That's taken the amount of trade covered by FTAs from 27% to 75% with the conclusion of the UK FTA. We've been principled because when you're standing up for your exporters, you have to take a principled stand. You can't be wishy-washy, you have to take a principled stand. And that's exactly what we've done when we've stood up for our exporters, especially when they have faced economic coercion. And we've been patient. We've been patient because when you're going to get reform of the World Trade Organisation, you've got to make sure that you can work with other countries, take the time and get the reform that you need. Now, I've been asked about alternative policies. Now, the first approach that I've heard of from those opposite is the fork-tongue policy. This is when you're having a bet each way. When you're asked about our current trade disputes with China and how you would resolve them. And what do you say? I would like China to withdraw some of the actions that have been taken to stop Australian products going to China. The Leader of the Opposition. Some. So is it our rock lobster in Western Australia, our barley growers in South Australia, our beef producers in Queensland. Who misses out? Who misses out? We need to know from the Leader of the Opposition. You can't have a bet each way when it comes to these policies. And then the other approach, and this is a beauty too, is the Labor Greens unity ticket policy. The Labor Greens unity ticket policy. Because, surprise, surprise, guess what the Greens want to do if they're in coalition with Labor at the next election? They want to review each one of our FTAs. And guess what the current policy of the Labor Party is when it comes to our FTAs? They want to review every single one of our FTAs. So you're not focused on negotiating new ones. You're not out there focusing on what would you do with India. They're saying they would renegotiate all our FTAs. Now, you know what that means? That means every one of our exporters you would put in jeopardy by renegotiating those FTAs, which now cover 75% of our exports.
Just before I call the member for Griffith, I just send out a general request from the chair that if ministers can, I know there's a natural desire to want to address members on your own side, but it's helpful when ministers talk into the microphone. The member for Griffith has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last night, 10 News revealed the Prime Minister plans to sack the Education Minister after Parliament rises this week. Can the Prime Minister confirm his government is falling down around him, with cabinet leaks, damaging text message leaks and even the sacking of ministers now being leaked to undermine the Prime Minister?
The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I have no intention of responding in relation to inaccurate reports in the media, Mr Speaker. I've been taking the matter that the member refers to extremely seriously, and I don't think it's a matter that should be trivialised in the way that those opposite are seeking to do, Mr Speaker. The matter is in process and it is not included, and I think it is only reasonable, Mr Speaker, and fair to all of those, including the Minister and others who are involved in this matter, that I not make any further comment on that process until it is concluded. But, Mr Speaker, I've been asked more generally about matters, and, Mr Speaker, what our government is focused on is three very important things. Firstly, to keep our economy strong in the middle of a 1 in 100-year pandemic. And our economy, Mr Speaker, with the unemployment rate going to below 4% for the first time in 50 years, Mr Speaker, some 1.1 million jobs created since the pandemic hit, some 11.5 million Australians benefiting from tax relief, some 700,000 jobs saved specifically through JobKeeper, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It goes to relevance. It did go to a serious issue. The issue of leaking of a cabinet is a really serious issue. It's actually a criminal offence, Mr Speaker.
Yes.
And there's more like a damn wall burst over there.
All right. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. There was a part of the question which was extremely broad. I don't write the questions. There was a part of the question that was extremely broad. I can't direct the Prime Minister to just answer one part of the question. It was multi-pronged, and the Prime Minister is able to answer the question. He is relevant, and I ask him to return to the dispatch box.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And in addition to those 700,000 jobs that were saved through JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, as the Minister for Trade has just been pointing out, Mr Speaker, our government has been expanding the borders of our own trade around the world, most recently with the United Kingdom, Mr Speaker, but such that over 70%, some 71.3% of our trade and exports are now covered by free trade agreements. Mr Speaker, when we came to government, there were some 647,000 female business operators in this country, and today there are 815,600 female business operators in this country, and there are 1 million more women in work today than there was when the Labor Party last sat on these benches. There's 220,000 trade apprentices in training today, the highest level we have seen since 1963, Mr Speaker. In addition to that, we're supporting manufacturing businesses to boost our sovereign capability. There's some 5,054 grants worth over $2 billion, which is supporting manufacturing businesses since we came to government, ensuring that manufacturing employment in this country and manufacturing capability is being expanded. Electricity prices have come down by over 5% in the last year and over 8% over the last 2 years. But the other objectives we've had, Mr Speaker, to keep Australians safe through this pandemic, keep Australia safe in one of the most dangerous global times we have seen, Mr Speaker, and standing up for Australia, unlike those opposite, Mr Speaker, who are the preferred choice of a government who has been coercing Australia.
The member for Ryan has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the outstanding Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's Operation Sovereign Borders is continuing to keep our borders secure and people smugglers out of business, and is she aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the outstanding member for Ryan for that fabulous question. Mr Speaker, Australia's borders have always been critical to ensuring the safety and the security of our community. And as many parts of the world go through some pretty serious upheaval, we've been very conscious to make sure that we have very clear and consistent policies on border security that breaks the people smugglers model. Now, it's been well over 2,500 days since the last illegal people smuggling boat arrived on our shores. Now, when the Coalition came to office, illegal boats were arriving at a rate of several a week, and there were tragic consequences involved with that. Now, 50,000 people on more than 800 boats under Labor arrived here, and there were tragically over 1,200 deaths at sea. And we don't know exactly how many there were because we don't know how many boats did not even make it to a level of safety here. Now, as a result of that, there were over 10,000 people in immigration detention, including over 1,000 children. So that is Labor's legacy. That is their legacy on borders, which is absolute chaos. And the Australian people should actually be very, very wary, because back in 2007, those opposite said, with their hand on their heart before the election, that they wouldn't change a thing. And nothing could have been further from the truth, because when they came into government, they started to dismantle our very strong border policies. They couldn't help it, and quite frankly, the left of the Labor Party has always won out on borders. Now, that's exactly what would happen again if ever they would come back into government. Now, not only did the Leader of the Opposition vote against turnbacks at his own Labor conference, but the member for Gilmore signed a pleading letter to the conference to, and I quote, "reject mandatory detention, offshore processing and boat turnbacks." Now, the member for Gilmore has absolutely revealed what the view of those opposite really is, and it is concerning. That was the member's stated position. And so heartfelt was her view on that she was the #1 signatory on a very long list of individuals, including lifetime Labor members and a vast array of union officials. Now, Mr Speaker, Operation Sovereign Borders has been particularly effective. We stopped the boats, we stopped the time of boats,
on my left.
We damaged the people smugglers model. And many of the people who are responsible for Labor's failed policy are still here in this chamber today. That gives us no prospect that there will be any change to their policy.
The Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last week, the Prime Minister said the National Anti-Corruption Commission he promised in December 2018 could be legislated before the election. Now, the Attorney-General has confirmed the government will not put legislation to Parliament this term. Why won't the Prime Minister do his job and deliver an anti-corruption commission?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We've tabled our legislation for that Integrity Commission. We have tabled it, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party don't support it, and that's why it's not proceeding.
The member for Berowra has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's plan to strengthen Australia's criminal deportation laws? Is the Minister aware of any contrary approaches or views on this reform?
The Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs has the call.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Berowra for his question. I know his experience in the law and understanding the law and how it operates in relation to the deportation of foreign criminals. It's true to say, Speaker, the Morrison government has pursued improvements to the Migration Act to increase our ability to deport foreign criminals for over 1,200 days now. Indeed, we've sought this before every election, and we've asked the Parliament for the ability to do it for so long now that every member of this House has had the opportunity to understand what is before the Parliament, what it does and what it doesn't do, and how it operates. And that's why it's disturbing to hear consistently that people still claim a lack of understanding about what the government intends in relation to the Migration Act. In fact, in 2019, I'm happy to tell the House, 2019 was an election year. Before that election, in relation to this bill, the Leader of the Opposition told 6PR that this bill was a, quote, good idea, unquote, 6PR radio, before the last election. After the election, Labor and the Greens voted twice against it in the Parliament, Mr Speaker. And now we're in 2022. Today we've been advised, 1,200 days in, that Labor now supports this bill again. That's what we've been told today. That's an unconfirmed report, Mr Speaker, so far. But the government does intend to put this bill into the House today, and the test for the Leader of the Opposition is to abandon his Green allies finally and come into this Parliament and vote on it. If you voted twice against it, will you now come into this chamber and vote for it? That's what the people of Australia want to know. Will you take public safety seriously? Because it isn't good enough to hide in your office and put this bill through on the Voices and send it to the Senate, where you know we've run out of time potentially to pass this bill. It's important, if you are going to change your position at the last minute with the election impending this year, that you come into this chamber, put your money where your mouth is with your members, side with public safety and vote in favour of this public safety bill.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Speaker, I'm worried about you, Mr Speaker, because the member opposite has denigrated you about 30 times during this contribution. I'm worried about the standing.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Minister is reminded that any reflections of you are reflections to the Chair. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. And the Leader of the Opposition knows full well he's got a responsibility to Australia. And the question becomes, after 1,200 days, 1,100 and I think, 70, he's been in a coalition with a member for Melbourne. Now we're to believe he's dropped that coalition in the last 30 days with an election impending. Will he break with the policy direction from the Australian Greens and support the government's sensible laws to protect the safety of Australians? Will he put his money where his mouth is to protect women, to protect children, to make sure that we have the capacity to stop foreign criminals coming here in the first place and to deport them when they do commit crimes? We'll only find out, I suggest, Mr Speaker, today when he's consulted with his non-coalition partner, his ally, his friend, his whatever the relationship status may be, from the member for Melbourne We'll see if he joins us on this side of the chamber today.
The member for Dunkley has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. 3 years after the Morrison-Joyce government promised $660 million for 47 commuter car parks, only 6 are operational. An Auditor General's report found 77% of these projects were pledged to coalition seats at the last election. Instead of wasting taxpayer money on rorts, why hasn't the Prime Minister done his job and legislated for a National Anti-Corruption Commission?
No, you haven't given you the call yet. Members on my left. The Minister has the call.
I do thank the member for her question. I think that question earns the non sequitur award of the afternoon, but nevertheless, let me be very clear to the House, Mr Speaker, let me be very clear to the House that the communities around Australia where people turn up wanting to get on the train to go to work and they turn up at 6 or 6:30 or 7 in the morning and there are no commuter car parks available to them. For example, I visited Water Gardens in northwestern Melbourne, where I saw today how commuters are forced to park up to 1 kilometre away on the dirt on the side of a busy road and walk to the station along an unpaved cutting. We are doing something about that. We are committing funding for the Water Gardens commuter car park under our $70 million commitment to the northern lines of Melbourne, one of 6 commuter car parks under construction right now. Berwick in Victoria, Coomera in Queensland. I was with the Queensland Labor Transport Minister announcing the commencement of construction on the Coomera Park and Ride, and I can tell you that when people turn up to a location like that, they're not asking about lines on spreadsheets. They're asking about how can we get a facility built so that we can get to work and get on and provide for our families, not turn up and find that there is nowhere to park. That is a very similar story in Emu Plains in Western Sydney, where a commuter car park is under construction. It's a very similar story in Ferny Grove, where a commuter car park is under construction, and I know that the Minister for Defence was there at the opening event at the commencement of construction. It's a similar story in Revesby in New South Wales, where a commuter car park is under construction. In Beaconsfield in Victoria, where a commuter car park has been completed, funded under this government's program. In Craigieburn in Victoria, in Croydon, in Epping, in Hurstbridge, in Mandurah in Western Australia. We are getting on with delivering infrastructure projects around the country that are designed to meet the needs of Australians. We're getting on with it. That's what we're here to do, and that's what we're doing.
The member. It's like this wall of noise has started to appear from the very, very far back, led by the member for Bruce, I'm sure. The member for Flynn has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Resources and Water. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is ensuring a secure supply of affordable gas supplies for Australian manufacturers while assisting our friends and allies meet their energy needs? Is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Resources and Water has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Flynn for his question and congratulate him on his valedictory last week? Another outstanding contribution. Mr Speaker, the member for Flynn understands how important it is that we maintain a pipeline of projects for gas and other resource projects. He has the big exporters at Gladstone, out of the Gladstone port, and at a time of great instability around the world, Mr Speaker, and you only have to look at the situation in Ukraine to understand how important it is to this nation's security and our economic security that we maintain this pipeline and continue to deliver gas not only for our domestic needs but right around the world. Mr Speaker, we've seen a report overnight from the ACCC around pricing. The instability that we are seeing has seen very large increases for the gas price in particular in places like Europe and Asia. In fact, those prices are between $30 and $40 a gigajoule right now. Now, in this country, the ACCC reports that offers have been under the $10 mark and around $10 in recent times, and that is a significant differential to the world price. Now, it's important that we continue to maintain that supply. It's important that we continue to ensure that it is affordable and reliable for Australia's manufacturers, for Australia's domestic use. Because, Mr Speaker, without it, we can't produce urea, we can't heat our homes, we can't produce electricity at affordable prices. So we'll continue to do that. Now, those prices, Mr Speaker, have been maintained because the policy of this government has ensured that it happens. Whether it's the implementation of the Australian Domestic Gas Security Mechanism, which allows me as the Minister for Resources to direct more gas into the domestic market, whether it's the heads of agreement that we've signed with the big exporters out of Gladstone on the east coast, which they are meeting the terms of, Mr Speaker. They have to put forward any uncontracted supply for use in the domestic market first. Now, what is very clear is that it is working. We are ensuring those prices are staying down. We are ensuring that that reliability of supply is there. That gives confidence to investors into this country. That is why they are coming here to look for more opportunities like the Beetaloo Basin and others. Now, Mr Speaker, we will continue to work on gas production in this country. It's why we have a gas-led recovery. It's why we put forward strategic basin plans like the Beetaloo, like the Addervale and the Cooper, like the Bowen and the Galilee, because we need to make sure that supply is continued into the future, because without it there will be a shortfall. And I'd say to states like Victoria, who have a moratorium on unconventional gas, this is the reason they will have challenges in the near term, because if they don't produce enough gas locally, they'll need to look to the north and look to Queensland and others for that supply. Now, it simply can't be provided at the price you can get out of the Bass Strait. So, Mr Speaker, I am asked about alternatives. Now, the alternatives are pretty straightforward. We've heard what the Greens' alternative is. There will be no more projects. In fact, they doubled down and said even the projects that are approved they would get rid of under an alliance with the Labor Party in government. That is the statement. That is what they've put into this place as an actual proposal. So, Mr Speaker, we'll stand with the resources sector. We'll ensure the security of this country. We'll ensure its economy and the jobs into the future.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask, does the Prime Minister agree with the Australian's editor-at-large Paul Kelly, who wrote today, to quote, "Pivotal to Australia's success in its pushback against China has been support from the public and bipartisanship from Labor. This bipartisanship is a national asset. The election needs to leave Australia in a stronger position to deal with China, not diminished and more divided."
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I find it hard to agree because Mr Speaker, when we have a leader of the Labor Party who claims to bipartisanship but says when it comes to the coercion of Australia on trade issues, he only wants to see some of that coercion, Mr Speaker. I've been going for 20 seconds. I don't think preciousness is a point of order, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to an issue, a mistruth that I have given previously a personal explanation on. Previous speakers have ruled that once a personal explanation is given, the mistruth cannot be repeated over and over again.
Part of the issue is, part of the issue is I didn't hear what the statement was. I'm not asking for it to be repeated, but you know, when the level of interjections are so high, this is the problem we have. I'm happy to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business, but I don't think I can rule on it because I didn't hear what the Prime Minister said. That's said to be offensive. I'm going to ask the Leader of the Opposition to resume his seat, and the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I was quoting from The Australian, the 28th of January 2022, some of the actions that have been taken to stop Australian products going to China. It's a direct quote of the Leader of the Opposition. He may wish to walk away from it, Mr Speaker.
I hope that wasn't directed at me, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker. You've now heard the quote. The quote then went on to say whether it be resources.
Just
hang on.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat.
Sit down.
The Leader of the Opposition will get to his point of order.
Yeah, I'm waiting, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition will get to...
Well,
the Leader of the House will resume his
thanks,
seat.
Mr Speaker. The quote went on to say whether it be resources, wine or agriculture, all of. It went on. It went on to make that clear. The Prime Minister is attempting to mislead. To be fair, there was a misleading quote somewhere as well. Ministers know that they're embarrassed by this, but I have made our position
on my right
very clear in our national interest, and this goes to the very quote
the Leader
that
of the
Paul
Opposition
Kelly made,
will resume his
which is
seat.
it is not.
I do before I hear from the Prime Minister, the Manager of Opposition Business was going to take me to a standing order. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I refer you to Standing Order number 68, and it's the section that follows C. It's not part of C. It's the part immediately following that, which gives the Speaker the right to intervene when the misrepresentation is made again, and when that's being used, it's often been in cases like this where there is a national interest gravity to it.
The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, on the point of order, the Prime Minister was reading a direct quote given by the Leader of the Opposition. Now, it may be inconvenient for him to hear those words, but it was a direct quote, Mr Speaker. It is not within the spirit of the section on 68, Mr Speaker, which says if, as the Manager of Opposition Business pointed out, if the member has given a personal explanation to correct misrepresentation and another member subsequently repeats that, and it goes on. But, Mr Speaker, this is not a misrepresentation. This is a direct quote of a comment from the Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister is entirely...
Just wait one moment. I really don't need the commentary. It's not assisting the Leader of the House.
Speaker, 68 goes to the circumstance where somebody has made a misrepresentation about a member of the House. The matter is cleared up after question time by way of submission from the member claiming to have been offended against, and it is then a repeat of that misrepresentation so that, for example, that they were there at an event but they weren't at that event, or they said, blue but it was actually red. It's not that, Mr Speaker. The quote that the Prime Minister is quoting to question time is a direct quote from the Leader of the Opposition. It is quoted in the Australian newspaper. It may be inconvenient to the Leader of the House to hear those questions because it goes to his weakness on China. But, Mr Speaker, the submission clearly says, the standing order, Mr Speaker, is very clear. It's in relation to a misrepresentation and it does not apply in these circumstances.
All right. I thank both the Leader of the House and the Manager of Opposition Business. I agree with the Leader of the House. The Prime Minister has the call.
And it was again the Leader of the Labor Party when he was asked about Mr Keating's comments criticising AUKUS and said China was not a threat, Mr Speaker. This was his response, the Leader of the Labor Party. Paul Keating always has strong things to say, and it's always important to listen to what he has to say. He is wise counsel. Well, I don't agree with the Leader of the Labor Party that Paul Keating's criticisms of AUKUS and this threat, Mr Speaker, I don't share his view. Nor do I share the view, Mr Speaker, of the member for McMahon, Mr Speaker, who said, and I quote, if we win the next election with we will keep an open mind as to how Australia and China can best collaborate on the Belt and Road Initiative, Mr.
The
Speaker.
Prime Minister resume his seat. Member for Ryan. Minister for Health. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. On direct relevance. On direct relevance.
Look, the question is pretty broad. It goes and it talks about bipartisanship in relation to the relationship between Australia and China.
You were silly enough to ask.
Order. The Prime Minister is relevant, and I will ask him to return to the dispatch box.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But that's not enough, because, Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Treasurer has said this. The government, that is the Liberal National Government, has been a bit negative about the Belt and Road Initiative, Mr. Speaker. That's what he said. And then there was, of course, the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party, when he went up to Beijing, Mr. Speaker, and you won't be able to find the speech that he gave to the Beijing Foreign Studies University, Mr. Speaker. He's taken it off his website, but I'm pleased Senator Patterson has put it on his website, Mr. Speaker. And when he went up there, this is what he said. He said, our starting point, we respect China, deeply value the relationship. Yes, we must seek to build it, and not just in economic terms, he said, Mr. Speaker, but through exploiting political cooperation and even defence cooperation, Mr. Speaker. And he said that as a shadow defence, Mr. Speaker. So I tell you where I do agree, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
We got another Manchurian camp.
I didn't hear it. What? Just hang on. Just wait. Just everybody calm down for a moment. Did the Prime Minister use an unparliamentary remark?
Mr. Speaker, but I do agree with Paul.
No, the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Lyons, I didn't know. How could I possibly have heard what the Prime Minister has said? So, the member for Bruce is not being very helpful. The member for Lyons, that is not helpful either. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker, and it's on the dignity of the House, which this Prime Minister is undermining. The defence cooperation was started by your
government. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I don't need to hear from the Leader of the House. The Prime Minister withdrew. He did. He said, I withdraw. All right, yeah. Look, I appreciate the Prime Minister did withdraw it. The microphone didn't pick it up. So if you could just return to the dispatch box.
Mr. House, I will withdraw again, Mr. Speaker. On this, in that article, he said the election needs to leave Australia in a stronger position to deal with China, Mr. Speaker. And there is only one side of the House that has demonstrated, Mr. Speaker, the resolve on this question. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, the arbiter of that is the Chinese government themselves, Mr. Speaker, who has picked their horse and he's sitting right there.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to move the following motion. That so much of standing orders be suspended as would prevent 1. The Prime Minister making a statement of no longer than 10 minutes in relation to the national security of Australia. 2. The Leader of the Opposition speaking in reply for 10 minutes. And 3. Any variation to this arrangement to be made only by a motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition supported by the Prime Minister.
Is leave granted?
No leave granted for stunts. No.
Leave is not granted. The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the...
Just wait for a moment. Member for Lindsay. The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is securing the affordable, reliable energy that Australian families, business and industry rely on? Is the minister aware of any risks to this approach?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I
member for Lawler. The minister has the call.
And I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and for her passionate advocacy for manufacturing in her electorate. Her electorate has a strong network of manufacturers that rely on affordable, reliable energy, Mr. Speaker, and crucial to that is gas. Gas provides 42% of the energy requirement for manufacturers in this country, Mr. Speaker. It also is a critical industrial feedstock for products like urea, as we heard earlier today, and it also provides the firming necessary for the record level of investment we're seeing in renewables in this country, Mr. Speaker. And families, small businesses rely on that gas for hot water, for heating and for cooking, Mr. Speaker. But if supply of gas is short, prices go up. And you only have to look at what's happening around the world to see that, Mr. Speaker. We've seen tensions within Europe that we've talked about today, and we've seen underinvestment in gas in Europe in particular, Mr. Speaker, and that's driven up prices. Indeed, the UK saw the highest ever price it's seen, $50 a gigajoule in December last year, Mr. Speaker, and household energy prices have gone up in response to that. But that's not been our experience in this country, Mr. Speaker. That's not been our experience in this country, and as the ACCC has noted in its latest gas inquiry, our gas prices have been sitting as little as 25% of the price that you're seeing in other countries. That's 75% lower than Asia and European prices, Mr. Speaker, and central to that is the supply that we've seen coming on, ensuring that our manufacturers and other customers have Australian gas working for all Australians, Mr. Speaker. But I am asked about alternative approaches, Mr. Speaker, and risks to our approach. And the greatest risk is a Labor-Green partnership, Mr. Speaker, because the Greens have made it very clear that they will demand a ban on new gas projects, Mr. Speaker, in return for passing Labor's climate legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, Labor can protest as much as it likes about this, but we've heard about this from the member for McMahon, who has described the Greens as, I quote, a party that you can sit down and discuss policies with. We've done that, Mr. Speaker, but he goes on. He goes on and says, in the event that the Greens hold the balance of power, then, of course, we'd work in that arrangement, Mr. Speaker. And this morning he went further. He went further and he said that supply of gas in the gas-fired recovery is nonsense, Mr. Speaker. Further proof that Labor has lost touch with the blue-collar workers in manufacturing in this country. We will always be their supporters.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given it's almost 20 to 4, I ask that further questions be placed on notice.
The members leaving the chamber, if they could do so quickly and quietly, please. I've received a letter from the